is the world this weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Coming up on the program, families of foreign nationals stuck in Gaza wait for their loved ones to be able to leave and call for a pause to Israeli airstrikes.
That's why we need the pauses, because we don't want to see our family killed.
Meanwhile, protesters around the world demand a ceasefire, staging a national day of action.
We just don't want our government to support this. We want our government to be a leader in asking for peace and asking for a ceasefire.
Also ahead, the twisty tale of the crypto king and the NBA star and the multi-million-dollar Ontario mansion at the center of it all. We'll explain that story later. But first, Canadians who are hoping to escape from Gaza tomorrow may have to wait. Foreign nationals from several countries have been allowed to leave Gaza through the Rafah border crossing into Egypt, but the crossing was closed today. Reports say the shutdown came after Hamas tried to send some of its injured fighters over the border with civilians to receive medical treatment in Egypt. Tom Perry reports from Cairo.
Video released by Israel's military shows Israeli soldiers backed by tanks and bulldozers advancing past ruins of buildings in Gaza, pummeled to rubble and ash. Israel's relentless assault in pursuit of Hamas militants continues to pound and punish the territory and its people. Foreign nationals, dual citizens, and anyone with a chance to get out of Gaza has been trying to escape. The territory's borders were sealed shut until this week when the Rafah crossing into Egypt reopened. People in Canada with family in Gaza anxiously awaited their return.
We don't want to see our family killed. We don't want that. It's really hard.
Ahmad Abu al-Jadeen is a permanent resident of Canada. His wife went to Gaza to visit family before the Hamas attack and ended up stranded. It was in Gaza where she last month gave birth to their daughter Sila.
They have no equipment there. No painkiller. She got stitches with no painkiller, nothing.
Global Affairs Canada had said Canadian citizens could start leaving Gaza through the Rafah crossing as early as tomorrow. But the Canadian embassy in Cairo today confirmed the crossing was closed today, a day when more than 700 people were supposed to pass through. The New York Times and others have quoted a U.S. official blaming the delay on Hamas, saying the group tried to send injured fighters into Egypt among the foreign nationals. Canadian officials quietly admit this is a setback in their plans to get Canadians out. And tonight, Asha Mathkour, a Canadian stuck in Gaza, says she received a call from Global Affairs with some bad news.
They said that due to the closure today, right now, there's going to be a lot of crowd and it's going to be really packed tomorrow. So they delayed all the departures of all Canadians for another 24 hours.
Mathkour says Global Affairs told her they'd call again tomorrow with more information.
So fingers crossed, another 24 hours. I hope we make it through the night tonight and we stay safe until then.
The federal government has said since the beginning this is a fluid situation, but it's also become increasingly complex. And for now, Canadians and others are left waiting. Tom Perry, CBC News, Cairo.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Jordan meeting with Arab leaders after talks with Israeli officials yesterday. Blinken and other world leaders, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, are asking for a humanitarian pause in the fighting to let more aid into Gaza as conditions continue to deteriorate. Susan Ormiston has more from Jerusalem.
Protesters broke through security barriers around the Israeli Prime Minister's residence tonight in Tel Aviv, demanding the government negotiate with Hamas to release the hostages captured October 7th. Friends and families are becoming increasingly impatient and worried. With ground troops closing in on Gaza City under the cover of continued airstrikes, trying to cut off Hamas's stronghold from the south. A man cycling on a road heading south from Gaza City took a video showing at least 7 bodies, including women, strewn along the side of the highway. Hamas says Israeli shelling hit a boys' school, killing at least 15 in Jabalia refugee camp where thousands of people were sheltering. I was standing here when 3 bombings happened, said a young boy. I carried a body and another decapitated body with my own hands. God will take my vengeance, he said. The Israeli military says the explosion may have been caused by IDF fire aimed at another target. It is under review.
Egypt is exerting its all efforts to guarantee that delivering aids to the Gaza Strips.
In Amman, Jordan, a meeting of Arab foreign ministers revealed the wide gulf between Israel and its U.S. ally and the leaders of 5 Arab states, including Egypt. Its foreign minister called for a break in the war immediately, rejected by Israel and again today by the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
It's our view that a ceasefire now would simply leave Hamas in place, able to regroup and repeat what it did on October 7th.
A diplomatic compromise could be a temporary pause to let more aid into Gaza. Israel's drawn a red line. No pause, it says, without the release of hostages.
The whole region is sinking in a sea of hatred that will define generations to come.
Jordan's foreign minister, Ayman Safadi, says the deep and lasting damage of this war is already embedded.
That is already starting to manifest itself in expressions and acts of hatred in the region and expressions of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism.
Blinken goes on to Turkey tomorrow as anti-war protests over his visit erupt in Istanbul. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Jerusalem.
Israeli media is reporting plans are in the works for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to visit Israel. It'll be Zelensky's first visit since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. According to Israeli media outlet Haaretz, the visit could come as soon as next week and has the backing of the United States. In cities across Canada, the United States, and around the globe, thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters are marching through the streets as part of an international day of action calling for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war. Nicole Williams reports from Ottawa.
Palestine will be free! Palestine will be free! Thousands of people flooded downtown Toronto this afternoon, chanting, waving the Palestinian flag, and demanding world leaders do more to protect the people of Gaza, including Dalia Awad with the Palestinian Youth Movement, who has family in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
I fear for their safety, and I fear that the world is standing by as they allow a genocide to take place.
Gar Sabar is a member of Jewish Independent Voices, also there to condemn Israel's actions on behalf of Jews like him.
It's an abomination. I think we're all angry beyond belief.
Demonstrations are taking place in close to 30 cities in Canada from coast to coast, including in the nation's capital.
Justin Trudeau, you can hide! You signed up for genocide! You signed up for genocide!
Amar Athana is one of the thousands on Parliament Hill this afternoon. He's with the Association of Palestinian Arab Canadians.
And we just don't want our government to support this. We want our government to be a leader in asking for peace and asking for a ceasefire.
It's a similar picture in more than 100 cities around the world today as people gather for a day of action calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Earlier today, thousands poured through the streets of London.
You just can't just stand by and watch it. You have to do something.
Gatherings in France, Germany, Norway, Turkey, Venezuela, Chile, and Australia too. One of the biggest demonstrations in Washington, D.C., with tens of thousands of people marching on Capitol Hill, many like this demonstrator with strong words for President Joe Biden.
3,800 children plus have been killed by U.S.-funded Israeli missile strikes. How many more need to happen? How many more people and children need to be killed?
The calls for action around the world becoming louder and more desperate as Gaza continues to get bombarded and the number of dead keeps rising. Nicole Williams, CBC News, Ottawa.
Alberta's United Conservative Party is wrapping up its annual general meeting, which included a closely watched keynote speech by Premier Danielle Smith. Nearly 4,000 delegates attended, making it one of the biggest political conventions in Canadian history. But there are divisions. Erin Collins has the story.
My fellow Conservatives, Alberta is leading, and we must continue to lead.
Danielle Smith playing to the crowd at her party's AGM. First time Alberta's premier has spoken to her party's members since winning the province's spring election.
That election victory and the growing strength of our party is so critical to the future of our province and to the future of our country.
But even in victory, there are some potential signs of division inside the United Conservative Party. The group Take Back Alberta takes credit for punting former UCP leader Jason Kenney. Now, TBA has flooded this convention with delegates to vote on policy resolutions and for key leadership positions, hoping to move the party further to the right on social issues, focused on parental rights and health care reform. The Premier's job today, to unite her party against a common and familiar foe.
There are powerful forces on the left in this country, including the Liberal NDP coalition government, who believe that our province is a problem, a threat to their power and worldview.
Alberta's antagonism with Ottawa likely to heat up in the weeks and months to come. Conflict on issues from carbon taxes to the Canada Pension Plan likely in the cards. Erin Collins, CBC News, Calgary.
When a doctor orders things like blood work, you end up in a medical lab. In Alberta, those medical labs have shifted from public to privately owned and back again. Critics say these decisions are based more on ideology than evidence, and the consequences for this medical tug-of-war can be shattering for patients. Christine Birak reports.
And what we'll do is we'll get you started off with the urine sample.
Nearly three-quarters of all medical diagnoses start with a lab test. Many are covered. The results go directly to your doctor. So whether a lab is publicly owned or private for-profit isn't something you would even notice, except when things go wrong.
The wait times for appointments with the private labs was about double.
Cam Clark lives in Calgary. He's recovering from skin cancer and needs ongoing treatments.
They're critical. Without the lab tests, they cannot do the treatments. They cannot provide them. It would not be safe to do so.
Alberta has been flipping community medical labs between public and private hands for decades without disclosing the cost to taxpayers. Alberta's Auditor General is now investigating after lab services went from being publicly run to privately owned, then switched back to the public sector, all within about 1 year. Some policy experts say they know why it's happening.
The driving force behind so much of these changes has to come down to political ideology.
University of Alberta researcher Rebecca Graff-McRae has done extensive research on Alberta's medical lab services.
There's always a lot of carefully worded verbiage in any government policy change that talks about quality of service and improving access. Particularly over the last few years here, we've seen the evidence that that's not the case.
A 2016 Health Quality Council of Alberta report found a private lab service company in Edmonton was 5 to 10% more costly than a publicly owned lab in Calgary.
Order, honourable members.
In 2017, the NDP announced plans for a $600 million hub lab in Edmonton to process test results for Albertans. 2 years later, the United Conservative Party announced that project would be bulldozed. Jason Kenney entered into a 25-year deal, privatizing all lab services by the end of 2022. By August of this year, there were so many problems, all lab services were returned to the public sector.
It was stressful because it actually backed up hospital beds.
Edmonton Dr. Lenora Saxinger says testing has improved since returning to the public sector, but Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith has left the door open to yet another switch.
The idea that it might change yet again is really kind of daunting to imagine because it's just been so chaotic.
Many health policy experts say contracting out health services to private companies can work if they're still publicly funded, integrated with other services, offer transparent data, equal or better outcomes for patients and cost less than the public system.
I think that we need to take the ideology out of how health care is delivered.
Joel Lexchin is a retired ER doc who taught health policy at York University in Toronto. He says what's happening in Alberta offers lessons for other governments.
The fundamental philosophy of the way the system runs should be based on evidence.
The report from Alberta's Auditor General is expected early next year. Many experts say what lab workers and patients need now is stability and quality care. Christine Birak, CBC News, Toronto.
There was another blow to Canada's struggling media landscape this week. Quebec's largest television broadcaster, TVA Group, announced it's cutting more than 500 jobs. That's nearly 1/3 of its workforce. Analysts and politicians say it is a massive loss for Quebec culture. Alison Northcott has more.
I'm among the 547 who were told they have lost their jobs.
Louis-André Larivière is a news editor who has worked at TVA for nearly 15 years, now trying with his union to minimize the impact of the cuts on workers.
We're not really understanding why all the reorganization is happening the way it has.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au TVA Nouvelles.
The TVA network is a staple across Quebec, broadcasting news and Quebec entertainment shows for decades. Now it will overhaul its news division and end in-house production of entertainment programs. The CEO of Quebecor, the network's parent company, Pierre-Carl Pelledeau, says it needs to reduce costs as it faces declining ad revenue and stiff competition from web giants and streaming services.
It's certainly not easy, but at the end of the day, we have a responsibility. The responsibility to make sure that, TVA will remain alive and kicking.
Pelledeau also pointed to public broadcasting, calling CBC Radio Canada unfair competition.
TVA has been part of the Quebecers' lives for many years.
Jean-Hugues Roy is a journalism professor at the Université de Québec à Montréal. He says the cuts are a big loss and a bad sign.
It's hard to compete against Netflix on the same field, especially since even though the audience is there, the revenues aren't. So this is the big problem.
Part of the changes will affect TVA operations in regions outside of Quebec City and Montreal. Éric Pierre Champagne, president of Quebec's Federation of Professional Journalists, worries about the impact on local news.
When you don't have information about what's happening in your community, it's bad for democracy, it's bad for a lot of things. It could be bad news for community.
Premier François Legault says there are a lot of problems to address.
We'll discuss that with representatives of different medias, and we hope to come with solutions as soon as possible.
The federal heritage minister, Pascal Saint-Onge, says the government has been working to modernize the Broadcasting Act to reflect the current reality.
We're looking at all the ways that the government can keep on supporting our creators and our journalists across the country.
The federal government also passed the Online News Act, which will force large platforms like Meta and Google to negotiate payment to Canadian media outlets when sharing their content. But that prompted Facebook to remove Canadian news sites from its platforms altogether.
Il n'est pas question.
Pelledeau says there's no question TVA will continue to exist and deliver news across the province. But many now wonder what the network will look like in the years to come. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
To Pakistan now, where aid agencies say up to 10,000 people a day are crossing the border into Afghanistan. The government gave all undocumented people in the country until November 1st to leave or be forcibly expelled. Pakistan has ignored pleas from the UN and human rights agencies who say forcing people back to Afghanistan will lead to a humanitarian crisis. Becky Roby with the Norwegian Refugee Council says the scenes at the border are desperate.
When people reach the border point, normally they have been travelling already for several days. They've been sleeping out in the open. In many cases, they've had to sell their personal belongings to pay for the transport. They've often left in a very hurried circumstance.
For more on this, I spoke to freelance reporter Abdul Sattar in Islamabad. So what's behind this decision? Why has the Pakistani government decided to expel Afghan refugees now?
There are some analysts who believe that basically Pakistan is trying to pile pressure on Afghanistan, and one of the factors that might have prompted Pakistan to take this action is the nexus between the Afghan Taliban and Pakistani Taliban. Afghan Taliban are supporting Pakistani Taliban, and Pakistani Taliban have carried out a number of attacks since the fall of Kabul and since Taliban came into power. So people believe that Pakistan asked Afghan Taliban to kick out Pakistani Taliban or prevent them from staging attacks inside Pakistani territory using Afghan soil, which Afghan Taliban ignored. And sending Afghan refugees to Afghanistan or kicking them out will pile pressure on Afghanistan, and it will make them rethink, their policy of ignoring Pakistani requests. And it is widely believed that the Afghan Taliban are hobnobbing with Russia and China, the two arch rival of the United States, and Pakistan has been trying to reset its ties with the United States. That has helped Pakistan achieve, bailout packages from the IMF. And it is believed that the United States might have asked Pakistan to use its influence over Afghan Taliban, asking them not to hobnob with Russia and China. And it seems that Afghan Taliban have also ignored this request. The third point is that Pakistan wants to, in a way, create problems for the Afghan Taliban regime because they are not listening to the demands of Pakistan. And a Peshawar-based analyst, Faizullah Jan, also agrees with it. And this is what he says on this issue.
Pakistan is trying to forcibly evict Afghan refugees from Pakistan because it will overwhelm the Afghan Taliban administration because they don't have the means, they don't have the will, and at the same time they don't have any plan to resettle these people inside Afghanistan.
Now, many of the people facing deportation fled Afghanistan after it fell to the Taliban in 2021. Some of them are waiting to be resettled in Western countries like Canada and the U.S. What can you tell us about them?
Well, I talked to some of these Afghans who have worked for NATO, for the United States, for donor agencies, for international organizations. Many of them are still waiting, and they said that not all the Western governments have taken emergency steps or measures to evacuate them, especially after Pakistan announced a deadline for Afghan refugees. But as far as United States and Canada are concerned, they were not happy with them, and they are still waiting for their legal process to be over. They were also complaining against Pakistan, saying that Pakistan is also trying to create problem, asking for different documents. So they say that we have no option but to wait for the legal process to be over.
Okay. You know, the Afghans living in Pakistan have done so for decades alongside Pakistanis. So do these deportations have public support in Pakistan?
Well, it varies from region to region. In the north western province of Pakistan and western province of Pakistan, there are some civil society organizations and human rights organizations. They are opposing this decision, but by and large, there is support for this decision.
Abdul Sattar in Islamabad, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. What would you do if your new $8.4 million mansion came with some unwanted visitors? That's the situation Canadian basketball star Shai Gilgeous-Alexander says he's in. It turns out his new home west of Toronto used to belong to Ontario's self-proclaimed crypto king, Aiden Pleterski. And Pleterski's investors may be looking to get back the $40 million they say they're owed. CBC's Nicole Brockbank has been investigating Aiden Pleterski for more than a year. She explained this latest twist. So how did Shai Gilgeous-Alexander wind up in the middle of this crypto king debacle?
Well, Stephanie, he bought an $8.4 million lakefront mansion in Burlington, Ontario this spring. And within a couple days of moving in with his girlfriend, the NBA star got an unwelcome surprise when a stranger showed up at his door demanding the whereabouts of Aiden Pleterski, someone the point guard claims he'd never heard of. But that quickly changed as Gilgis Alexander learned of an alleged series of threatening visits to the property before he moved in by people looking for Pleterski. The 24-year-old crypto king had lived in the mansion until his investment operation fell apart in the summer of 2022, and alleged threats led him to move out. Months later, in December, Pleterski was allegedly kidnapped by one of his investors and 4 other men who are now all facing charges.
So what has Gilgis Alexander done since he found out about the property's history?
Well, once Gilgis Alexander found out about those previous alleged threats, including to burn the house down, he and his girlfriend moved out immediately. So they only lived there for a couple of days back in May. And by June, he'd filed a lawsuit against the sellers to try and void the sale, arguing no one would have bought the mansion if the history of threatening visits had been disclosed and that the property is dangerous.
Okay, but how common is it for someone to try and reverse a home sale?
From what I've heard, Stephanie, it's very rare. Generally, the law is buyer beware, but there are a few exceptions, including for problems big enough to make a house dangerous. Even still, longtime Toronto real estate lawyer John Zanatti told me it's hard to get out of any real estate deal, let alone one that has already closed.
I've not seen a deal undone after the fact, with a judge ordering a seller to buy back the property from the buyer. I have not seen it. And I've closed something like 27,000 real estate deals in my practice over the last 27 years. The law is generally more inclined to award damages.
So in a statement of defense in the case, the sellers argue they weren't required to disclose the visits and the history of the property because they didn't make the home unfit or dangerous. Gilgis Alexander's lawyer declined a request for comment because it's still before the courts, and so there's no decision yet in the case, Stephanie, on how this will shake out for Gilgis Alexander at this point.
Wow, fascinating story, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
That was Nicole Brockbank in Toronto. And a quick reminder that tonight signals the end of daylight saving time. It happens at 2 a.m., so turn your clocks back before you go to bed and you'll get an extra hour of shut-eye. It's the case for everyone except the places that never observed daylight saving. That's Yukon, most of Saskatchewan, and some parts of BC and Quebec. The year 1958, a time of leather jackets, greased back pompadours, and at every dive bar and pool hall, one song playing on repeat from the jukebox. Rumble by Link Wray and his Wray Men. It has only 4 chords and no lyrics. The riff so dark and menacing, many radio stations refused to play it, fearing it would lead to juvenile delinquency. Rolling Stone would later write, it sounded like an invitation to a knife fight. And it changed rock music, paving the way for heavy metal and punk.
I first heard Link Wray's music via the Rumble, and it was when I was 14 years old.
Led Zeppelin's Jimmy Page inducted his hero into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame last night, praising Link Wray's sound.
I remember listening to it with such awe, because I thought, what is this? The vigor in it, the strength in it, the power in it, and you know something else that was fearless. It's just phenomenal. It's the essence of cool.
And Page isn't the only rock god to kneel at Link Wray's altar. This ominous track from the Stooges came 11 years later. And there are other children of Rumble, from Jimi Hendrix to Black Sabbath and AC/DC. Link Wray is also one of the few Indigenous musicians honored in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Wray was Shawnee, but rarely talked about his background, fearing a racist backlash. Link Wray would release more than 20 albums before his death in 2005, but it's Rumble that endures. So here's Jimmy Page, playing the song he says changed his life. This has been The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thanks for listening.